Mon Dieu, hello. Donc, contrast a naturally occurring story. Cracks in a rocks. Okay. Contrast a naturally occurring story. Cracks in a rock spelling out once upon a time there were 3 bears. The realization that the inscription was not made or used by anyone need not prevent us from reading and enjoying the story in much the way we would if it had been. It may be entrancing, suspenseful, spellbinding, comforting. We may laugh and cry. Some dimensions of our experiences of authored stories will be absent, but the differences are not ones that would justify denying that it functions and is understood as a full-fledged story. We will not achieve insight into the author or her society if there is no author, nor will we admire her skill as a storyteller or marvel at the perceptiveness of her vision of the human condition. Neither will we acknowledge her affirmations or protestations or receive her promises or apologies. But these opportunities, when we have them, are consequences of the author's having told a story, having produced an object whose function is to serve as a prop of a certain sort in games of make-believe. It is because she did this that we achieve insights about her, or marvel at her perceptiveness, or whatever. This make-believe function needs to be recognized apart from the interests in fiction makers which things possessing it often serve. To restrict fiction in its primary sense to actions of fiction making would be to obscure what is special about stories that does not depend on their being authored, on their being vehicles of perception storytellings. The basic concept of a story and the basic concept of fiction attach most perspicuously to objects rather than actions. Stories do not often occur in nature, but fictional pictures do. We see faces, figures, animals in rock patterns and clouds. The patterns or clouds are not vehicles of anyone's acts of picturing, of fiction making, but to rule that this automatically disqualifies them as pictures or that it makes them such only in a secondary sense would be to slight their role as props. This is a role they share with painted pictures, but it need not involve thinking of them as things of a kind normally produced in acts of picture making, or things of a kind normally presented or displayed as pictures. Naturally occurring designs are best regarded as pictures, full-fledged ones, when it is understood to be their function to serve as props in games of a specifically visual sort. The fundamental disanalogy between illocutionary actions and acts of fiction making comes out in differences in the roles of agents' intentions. A crucial question for a person on the receiving end of an illocutionary action is almost always, did he mean it? Did he intend to assert this, to promise that, to issue such and such an order or apology? But one may well read a story or contemplate a fictional picture without wondering which fictional truths the author or artist meant to generate. Photographers, especially, can easily be unaware of fictional truths generated by their works. Authors and other artists may be surprised at where extrapolation from the fictional truths they intentionally generated leads. This need not make any particular difference to the appreciator unless he is concerned with what the artist might be asserting in producing the fiction, what illocutionary actions she might be performing in the process of, and in addition to, producing it. And it does not justify a judgment that the action of fiction making was defective or did not come off at all. The notion of accidental fiction making is not problematic in the way that that of accidental assertion is. Fiction making is not reasonably classified as an illocutionary action, and works of fiction are not essentially vehicles of acts of fiction making. It may be that language is centered on the actions of speakers. The institution of fiction centers not on the activity of fiction makers, but on objects, works of fiction, or natural objects, and their role in appreciators' activities, objects whose function is to serve as props in games of make-believe. Fiction making is merely the activity of constructing such props. The fiction maker does come into play insofar as function is understood to depend on her intentions, but it need not be understood to depend on them. Our theory of fiction applies across the board independently of any particular means of fixing functions. In our society, the function of a text or picture, how is it to be used, may be determined partly by its maker's intentions. But another society might give less weight to this consideration or none at all, and even we determine the functions of natural objects differently. Functions are cultural constructs in any case, however, and nothing is fiction independent of a social, or at least human, context or, or setting. The naturally occurring story of the three bears is fiction only by virtue of people's understandings about how to treat certain kinds of texts. Such understandings need not involve anything like someone's making or presenting or displaying an inscription for a certain purpose, or meaning something by it, or doing something with it. It may be understood that any textual inscription beginning once upon a time is to serve as a prop, including any that no one even knows about. Along with the act of fiction making and that of presenting or displaying a fiction, we must exclude communication in any sense involving human communicators from the essence of fiction. Language may be essentially a means whereby people communicate with one another, hence the plausibility of basing the theory of language on actions of communicators, language users. To suppose that fiction is essentially a means of communication is no more plausible than to suppose it incapable of serving this purpose. People do communicate by means of fictions, and we are often interested in what their makers or users do with them or mean by them. Nothing I have said should detract from the role fictions often play as vehicles of action. What I insist on is separate recognition of the primary function of being a prop in games of make believe. Whether or not someone's producing or displaying something with this function is also of interest, and whether or not that function is conferred on it by the maker or displayer. In addition to being independent of language, of its serious uses in particular, the basic notion of fiction has turned out to be strikingly disanalogous to it. Mixtures, intermediates, ambiguity, indeterminacy. 2 seconds. Oh. A famous pianist just followed me. A great pianist. Great pianist. Maybe he'll come to the jam. And to my concert. Oh, my smiley's pretty. Not always, that's why I noticed it. He followed me, followed me. 2 seconds. J'arrive. Encore 2 secondes. Comment peut-on s'imaginer comment pourtant que la montagne est belle, comment peut-on s'imaginer vient d'arriver, pourtant que la montagne est belle, comment peut-on s'imaginer? The actual literary works that populate our libraries do not come neatly differentiated into two discrete piles, fiction and non-fiction, nor do works of other media. It is not at all obvious, in practice, where to draw the line. Much of the territory is grey, speckled, even chameleon-like. Perhaps there are at least some clear instances of each category, but even this must not be taken for granted. We can put aside uncertainties that rest on the endemic confusion exercised in 2.2. But even if we stick to the notion of fiction I have recommended, separating it clearly from those that oppose reality or truth or claims of truth, we will have plenty of puzzles on our hands. This fuzziness and its persistence through serious attempts to clarify and refine common sense notions of fiction has encouraged skepticism about the viability and significance of the distinction. See, for example, Fish, How to Do Things. It does not support such skepticism. Our objective is illumination. The purpose of an account of fiction is not to make classification easy, but to promote insight into the sometimes complex and subtle character of particular works. And insight does not consist in assigning each definitively to its own box. We do need to appreciate why works that resist classification do so, why and in what ways they are marginal or intermediate or mixed or ambiguous or indeterminate or whatever. But an account of fiction may serve this purpose without inscribing a precise line, even indeed if it does not enable us to identify any unambiguous cases at all. What we face is not a threat to the viability of the distinction of or our account of it, but a challenge to understand the ways in which works fail to fit comfortably on one side or the other. To throw up our hands in frustration would be to abandon the quest for illumination. Some works are mixtures of fiction and non-fiction. These are hardly problematic from a theoretical point of view. In a philosophical treatise, passages presenting hypothetical examples of evil geniuses, primitive language games, waiters who behave too much like waiters, brains in vats, unexpected executions, may qualify as fiction while the rest of the work does not. Metaphors or irony embedded in otherwise non-fictional contexts can sometimes be understood to have the job of serving as props in momentary games of make-believe. See 6.3. Novels and other predominantly fictional works may contain passages of non-fiction, no doubt, but entirely unambiguous instances are not easy to come by. It is reasonably obvious, often enough, that a passage in a novel is to be construed as a more or less straightforward observation or pronouncement about the actual world addressed by the author directly to the readers. The opening sentence of Anna Karenina, "Happy families are all alike, every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way," is frequently cited. There are discussions of love and other matters of real-world interest in Henry Fielding's novels. See, for instance, Tom Jones, Chapter 1 of Love. In footnotes to Kiss of the Spider Woman, Manuel Puig presents a series of apparently straightforward essays recounting the views of Freud, Norman O. Brown, Herbert Marcuse, William Reich, and others on sexuality. But it is rarely wholly clear that such passages do not also have the function of we'll see, of sorry, 2 seconds. Doesn't work. 2 seconds. Have the function of eliciting imaginings, of making it fictional, for instance, that someone, a character through whom the author speaks, or even the author himself, is making those pronouncements. If, in setting down the opening lines of Anna Karenina, Tolstoy was claiming, with allowance for some exaggeration, that all happy families really are alike, but that there are many different kinds of unhappy ones, his words may also make it fictional that someone, the narrator, utters them assertively. If this is their function, the passage is fiction in our sense. Really interesting. Another possibility is that the words make it fictional that they are true, that all happy families are alike and so on, but without making fictional that anyone asserts this. Still another is that they merely announce to the reader that this is fictional, it's being understood to be left to later parts of the novel, or to an assumption that the novel world is like the real world in this respect, to make it so. The passage does not qualify as fiction by virtue of its having the function of making this announcement. I was deliberately vague about the notion of function introduced in 1.7. Fiction, understood in terms of function, inherits this vagueness. Is it for a work to have as one of its functions the job of serving as a prop in games of make-believe? What counts as fiction will depend on whether we understand the work's function to depend on how its maker intended or expected it to be used, or on how, typically or traditionally, it actually is used, or on what uses people regard as proper or appropriate, whether or not they do so use it, or on how, according to accepted principles, it is in fact to be used, whether or not people realize this, or on one or another combination of these. There is no point in trying to be precise here, but we should be able to say in what sense or senses a particular work has the function of serving as a prop in games of make-believe, and in what sense or senses it does not. Since functions are society relative, so is fiction. The ancient Greek myths may have been non-fiction for the Greeks, but fiction for us. But see 2.8. Perhaps non-fiction for adults is sometimes fiction for children. The fuzziness of the distinction derives partly from uncertainties about what to take as the relevant social group. But something is fiction for one society and not for another less often than one might suppose. It is not uncommon for a work or a text to be used differently in different social contexts, but its function in a given society need not be assumed to coincide with the way it is used formally normally or even universally in that society. We have a tradition of respect for the genesis of works from other cultures and other lives. We often consider it proper or obligatory to do our best to find out how works were used or understood in the society in which they were produced, or how their makers intended or expected them to be used, and to use them similarly. Our rules for determining functions can be understood to require deferring sometimes to the society of origin. They may decree that a work's function for us is whatever it was for them, even if we are under severe misapprehensions about what its function was for them, and even if we actually use it very differently. See Saville's defense of the historicist conception of art against the autonomous one, Text of Time, Chapter 4. If the Greek myths were non-fiction for the Greeks, perhaps they are non-fiction for us also, despite the fact that we use and understand them as fiction. Alternatively, one might take functions to be essential to the identity of works. Perhaps a given painting or story necessarily has the function of serving as a prop in games of make-believe. Without that function, it would not be the thing that it is. This would mean that works are fiction or non-fiction absolutely, not just relative to one or another society. We might think of the myths as told by us as distinct from their Greek precursors, even if they share the same texts, the former being fiction absolutely and the latter non-fiction absolutely. Function is a matter of degree even when it is relativized to societies, and so is fictionality. It may be more or less the function of a given work for a given society to serve as a prop in games of make-believe, but there are differences of degree along several other relevant dimensions. A particular function which a work possesses to a greater or lesser extent may be more or less one of prescribing imaginings, as opposed to merely prompting them, more or less one of serving as a prop in games of make-believe. What a work has the function of prescribing may be, to a larger or lesser extent, imaginings rather than mere contemplatings of propositions. Borderline cases come in several varieties. We have seen that service as a prop in games of make-believe can coexist happily with service in other capacities. Props may also be vehicles of assertion, or vehicles of attempts to convey knowledge, or induce understanding, or cultivate wisdom, or spur action. A single work may have the function of performing all or any several of these roles. No doubt such combinations have encouraged hesitations about where to draw the line between fiction and non-fiction, especially since a work's make-believe role may be a distinctly minor one. We have seen that service as a prop in games of make-believe can coexist happily with service in other capacities. Props may also be vehicles of assertion, or vehicles of attempts to convey knowledge, or induce understanding, or cultivate wisdom, or spur action. A single work may have the function of performing all or any several of these roles. No doubt such combinations have encouraged hesitations about where to draw the line between fiction and non-fiction, especially since a work's make-believe role may be a distinctly minor one. Our notion of fiction suffers no indefiniteness on this account. A work, or a passage of a work, with the job of prescribing imaginings, is definitely fiction in our sense, no matter what other purposes it may have, and no matter how insignificant this one may be. But we need to be sensitive to the variety of tasks that may be assigned to a given work, their relative importance, and interactions among them. Although Bartley's dialogues between Hylas and Philonous presumably have the job of prescribing imaginings about a conversation between a certain Hylas and Philonous, this might be questioned. Perhaps one isn't to imagine the conversation very vividly anyway, or perhaps one is merely to imagine imagining it. This is obviously not their main purpose, and it is rather incidental to the accomplishment of their main purpose. That of presenting Berkeley's views on the nature of reality and his arguments for them, Berkeley might have forgone using Philonous as a mouthpiece with no great loss, and Hallas might have been replaced by more staid references to what an objector does or might say. The result would have been less colourful, but probably no less convincing and no less illuminating. The fictional element in the dialogues is scarcely more than a rhetorical flourish. In more interesting instances, it may not be clear which of the work's several purposes is the main one. And its various functions may interact with and reinforce one another in complex and subtle ways. In 2.4, I mentioned the non-fiction novels or factual fictions of the new journalism. There can be no doubt that a central purpose of male execution and song is to serve as a prop in games of make-believe. Its role in make-believe is in part, however, a means to the end of conveying information and insight about cultural historical event. Advocacy is frequently a significant objective of the new journalism as well. Participation and advocacy remain the touchstones of the new insurgent journalism. We are in special need of writers who, like A.G. Orwell and Camus, are committed in their bones to not just describing the world, but changing it for the better. This role is especially crucial, no doubt, in achieving and communicating understanding, in a sense that goes beyond the acquiring of factual information. The closer a serious writer gets to this material, the more understanding he gets, the more he is there no record those decisive moments of spontaneity and authenticity. He gets seek the context and sees scenes and details that distance and neutrality deny to the more unconventional reporters. He does not have to write about impersonal public rituals like ghost written speeches, well rehearsed concerts, and staged and managed press conferences. He is there to see and react to the human reflexes exposed late at night that illuminate a man's character. Although the imaginative activities the work inspires in readers also help to make the factual details of the historical events memorable, but the cognitive dimensions of these and similar works contribute in turn to their role in make-believe. The vivacity of the reader's imaginings may be enhanced by the knowledge that what he imagines is true, by this realization of the reality of the setting of a story and its characters and events. Even in the executioner's song, or Tolstoy's War and Peace, for that matter, is read mainly as a tragic fable or an adventure story and not with an eye to improving, in any direct way, one's knowledge or understanding of the actual historical events. It is likely to be more exciting, more gripping, if one takes it to be largely accurate than it would otherwise be. This is not to deny that imaginings in response to fairy tales can be as vivid as imaginings ever are. A lot of different things affect the vivacity with which we imagine, and no doubt several kinds of vivacity need to be distinguished. This point is related, no doubt, to the contribution actual objects of imagination make to the vivacity of one's imagining. To the extent that artistic purposes are distinct from cognitive ones, they may be served by getting the facts right. The enormous efforts novelists sometimes expend in researching the settings of their fictions and the historical figures they use as characters are not to be explained solely, sometimes probably not at all, by an interest in informing the reader about them. The purpose may be to use an exceptionally obscure word to enhance realism. Should we go by the primary or dominant function of a work in classifying it as fiction or non-fiction, insofar as that can be ascertained, rather than tying its status to the mere presence or absence of a given function? This seems to me an awkward alternative, especially if our goal is a recognizable refinement of the practice of librarians. No one will be tempted by the idea that non-fiction is distinguished from fiction by having as its primary purpose the achieving of cognitive aims, broadly speaking, any make-believe elements being subservient to this. Cognitive ends are by no means the proprietary property of non-fiction. Promoting understanding is arguably the primary objective of many paradigmatic works of fiction, including ones in which no unusual efforts are made to get the particulars right. Nor do, will it do to think of fiction as aimed primarily at achieving or conveying understanding, as opposed to merely imparting information, assuming, as I do, that this distinction can be made out. Great fiction may go for this understanding, but less so, though still paradigmatically fictional works may settle for imparting information. Moreover, understanding is probably the ultimate objective of much nonfiction, of much psychological and anthropological writing, for instance, as well as many histories and biographies, including ones that do not to any noticeable extent prescribe imaginings. The mere citation of well chosen factual details can contribute to a deep understanding of historical persons or events, and this may be the purpose of citing them. Legends and myths. One welcome hypothesis encouraged by these observations is that our own understanding of legends and myths originating in ancient or alien cultures, the ancient Greek myths and the Hindu Ramayana and Mahabharata epics, for instance, may have lot more in common with the ways they were understood in their original settings than is usually supposed. It is clear that many such legends are told and understood by us as fiction. Originally, according to a familiar story, they purported to be accurate reports of actual historical events. We cannot take them seriously in this spirit in our enlightened age, so we reinterpret them as fiction. One might say either that the original myth, which is not fiction even by outlights, was replaced by a homologous story, which is that there is but one enduring myth which was non-fiction for its originators and is fiction for us. In any case, the original telling of the story was supposedly straightforward truth claims, but contemporary tellings are fiction instead. That is to say, they have the function of serving as props in games of make believe. The tale of Orpheus' tragic attempt to rescue Eurydice from the underworld was regarded in ancient Greece, so the metamyth goes, much as we regard Sandberg's biography of Lincoln and the rise and fall of the Third Reich. For us, the Orpheus story is more like the Hobbit of the Wizard of Oz. This radical transformation may have occurred gradually, of course, and at intermediate stages, the status of the myth may have been undeterminate. This crude scenario is doubly dubious. Many myths may never have been straightforward truth claims. That is, in telling the myths, speakers may not have been claiming literal truth for them. I'm not advancing skepticism about whether telling them was a means of propounding morals or making general observations about the structure of the universe or the human condition or how best to live our lives. And even if they were, they may have been fiction all along. Ancient and Hindu myths in their original settings may have functioned, like the new journalism, both to convey information about matters of fact and also to serve as props in games of make believe. They may have been fiction originally, as they are for us, even if they were presented and accepted as faithful chronicles of past events. The presumption that they were thought of as faithful chronicles of past events at all should not be accepted lightly. Not all cultures are as constantly preoccupied with truth and falsity as ours is. I am indebted to Elizabeth Eisenstein for urgings in this direction. Hindu tellers of the Ramayana story and their audiences may not be much interested in whether Rama, Sita, and Ravana actually existed, or in whether a messenger of Ravana really did take the form of a deer in order to deceive Sita. Perhaps these questions simply do not arise. Tellings of the Ramayana story need not be understood as claims that such events did take place. If they are not, their main, if not exclusive, role must be in make believe. The Ramayana story and the ancient Greek myths as well may serve primarily as fiction in their home cultures. That is precisely their role in ours. Differences remain, of course. Whereas we actively disbelieve the myths constructed literally, the ancients or the Hindus may not have. A more important difference, probably, is that the stories occupied a more central position in their original cultures than they do in ours. How could anyone fail to care whether stories told to him by these elders, and which he in turn passes on to his progeny, are true? If this attitude surprises us, a little reflection would suggest that it is no less surprising sometimes that we do care as much as we do. Why are we interested in history, in the truth about past occurrences? Events of the remote past, especially, rarely impinge on our lives very directly. The massing of armies for an attack on a fiefdom 4 centuries ago is of much less immediate concern to us now than the East-West arms race or preparations for war among contemporary African tribes or mafia families. To be sure, ancient sieges and other remote events may have had consequences that affect us enormously. The Norman conquest of England did. The point is that our need to know about those events is usually not nearly as pressing as our need to know about more current ones. This is not to deny that history has lessons for us, of course, or that knowledge of even the most remote events does and should influence our lives. Sometimes one can generalize from the past and extrapolate to the future. Data about the causes of previous wars might help us to take steps to prevent the next one. But one or a few isolated incidents provide only an anecdotal grounds on which to base predictions. The truth or falsity of a given story passed down to me by my ancestors is unlikely to affect significantly the inductive basis on which I live my life. Many of the most important lessons of history are not of this sort. Past events can be richly illuminating in innumerable ways without themselves constituting grounds for the adoption of new beliefs. They can suggest possibilities, reveal promising lines of thought and experiment, inspire visions of the future, clarify and crystallize thoughts, facilitate the articulation of vague intuitions. They can force us to accept facts we would prefer not to know. Facts of history operate not in a vacuum, of course, but in conjunction with non historical information and other resources. Our evidence, insofar as the insights achieved are based on evidence, may be entirely contemporary knowledge gained from historical researches, acts as a catalyst, prompting the reorganization of information already in our possession as we notice analogies and contrasts between past situations and current ones, encouraging us to see things in a new light, revealing patterns and connections. C. Lewis, Truth in Fiction. Sometimes imagination is crucial. Imagining myself in a historical figure's shoes may afford insight into my own or another's psyche or into the spirit of a people or a culture. Historical accounts of his situation or behavior or state of mind may induce the appropriate imaginings, whether or not they provide significant evidence concerning matters of contemporary interest. Let us not assume that the benefits of historical knowledge are solely or even mainly cognitive, nor for that matter that there is a distinguishable category of cognitive effects or values. Knowledge of the past influences feelings and attitudes and behavior. It encourages people to accept or resist their fate, promotes satisfaction, foments revolution, soothes and stimulates. Past events are, again, catalysts in many cases rather than reasons for feeling or thinking or acting differently. There is no news in these observations, although the details of the manner in which historical knowledge induces insight and affect us in other ways deserve more study than they have received. What is important for us now is that for many such purposes, legend or myth may be as good as history. An avowedly unveridical tale may be as suggestive and stimulating as a trustworthy account of actual events, and may inspire similar insight. Fantasies, parables, hypothetical examples can often do the job of factual reports when the job does not involve using the actual occurrence of the reported events as evidence or reasons. Sophocles' portrayal of the Oedipus story may improve my understanding of matters of contemporary interest as much as I consider each apocryphal as it would if I thought it true. I quote this. 2 seconds. Smells. In any case, they need not have been pretending to assert, and the reader need not understand them to have been doing so in order to understand and appreciate their works as well as fiction. Constructing a painting or sculpted work of fiction is not thereby pretending to make truth claims. It is not pretending at all. Je vais juste illustrer ma marche. So why should we care whether the stories we hear of primeval happenings are true or false? Why not just accept the insight and stimulation they offer without bothering to evaluate their veridicality? When imagining is important, we may want to understand the story as fiction, as prescribing imaginings. We still need not decide whether it is true or even ask. This I am suggesting may be essentially the attitude some cultures have toward their myths. I'm quoting this also. While we are in the business of speculating about empirical matters, we might as well also consider the attitudes of children toward fairy tales. I am suspicious of the idea that very young children swallow fairy tales whole, taking them to be reports of received fact, and only later come to regard them as fiction. The question of their truth or falsity may simply not arise at first, and the naive younger child, as well as the enlightened older one, may use tales as props in games of make-believe, imagining appropriately in response to them. I recall Frank Sibley suggesting something along these lines. These speculations are just that. It is not my purpose to decide historical and psychological questions about how the Greeks or the Hindus regarded their myths or about children's attitudes toward fairy tales. But the picture I have sketched needs to be kept in mind. I take it to be a point in its favor that it avoids postulating that the enlightenment of a person or a culture effects a radical transformation in the nature of his or its interest in legends or tales. If that were the case, it would be hard to explain why the stories often have such strong appeal both before and after. The possibility of continuity across the Enlightenment is likely to remain unnoticed if we fail to distinguish clearly between fiction understood in terms of make believe and what is not true or not believed or not asserted. Otherwise, one may be so impressed with the change of cognitive attitude, attitude toward the stories in question, even if it is only from agnosticism to disbelief, that one overlooks the continuation of their role in make believe. A note on truth and reality. If men really could not distinguish between frogs and men, fairy stories about frog kings would not have arisen. Tolkien on fairy stories. I have spoken freely of truth, reality, and facts in this chapter and earlier without mentioning the notorious philosophical perplexities attending these notions. 2 seconds. Again. I brazenly assume that it makes sense to speak thus, that there is a difference between what is and what is not, and that telling it like it is differs from telling it otherwise. like it is, differs from telling it otherwise. This stance is less daring than it may seem to those who find it daring. Readers who see no risk at all may skip this section. For I have not endorsed any specific conception of the nature of reality or truth in our facts. In particular, I do not assume that reality is a realm of things in themselves, independent of sentient observers, nor that to be true is somehow to picture or mirror this objective reality, to correspond to the way things really are. There may be a significant sense in which facts are not found but made, in which reality is the product rather than simply and straightforwardly the target of thought and word. What is true and what is false may be dependent on or relative to or conditioned by a culture or a language or a conceptual scheme or a theoretical framework of the constitution of the human mind. It may make sense to ask how things are only from within a particular language game or root metaphor or paradigm or theoretical framework or only with reference to certain forms of intuition and categories of understanding. We can remain neutral as to how truth and reality are to be understood. If our objective were to investigate fiction as opposed to reality or truth, probably we would have to take sides, but it isn't, and we don't. I have argued elsewhere, linguistic relativity, for the plausibility of the old idea that there is no such thing as the way the world is in itself, that things as they are conceived by one or another sentient being may be all there is. This is fortunate, for the rivalry between correspondence theories and their competitors, coherence and pragmatic theories, conceptions of truth as warranted assertability or in terms of uterine conditions, reductions of reality to appearance, will not be resolved in a day or a chapter or a book, and we must get on to fiction. There is a way of making worries about the objectivity of truth and reality look dangerous to our enterprise, however, at least to the casual eye, a way that does not rest entirely on confusions involving fiction as opposed to reality or truth. If reality is less than objective, our own invention rather than something out there for us to discover, how does it differ from realms of fiction which we invent also? Could it be that the real world is no more than a fancy name for just another fictional one? If so, what becomes of the difference between discourse about it and discourse concerning the worlds of Oz and Anna Karenina? Stanley Fish raises the spectre thus. Wait 2 seconds. Shared pretense is what enables us to talk about anything at all. When we communicate, it is because we are parties to a set of discourse agreements which are in effect decisions as to what can be stipulated as a fact. It is these decisions and the agreement to abide by them, rather than the availability of substance, that make it possible for us to refer, whether we are novelists or reporters for the New York Times. One might object that this has the consequence of making all discourse fictional, but it would be just as accurate to say that it makes all discourse serious, and it would be better still to say that it puts all discourse on a par. The distinction between serious and fictional discourse cannot be maintained if the implications of speech act theory are clearly and steadily seen. Fish, How to Do Things. Fish and others have suggested that it is discourse itself which creates our reality. The France you are talking about will always be the product of the talk about it, and will never be independently available. All writing, all composition is construction. We do not imitate the world, we construct versions of it. It's called structural fabulation. As the argument went, non-fiction could no more chronicle reality than fiction, since all forms of writing offer models or versions of reality rather than actual descriptions of it. Consequently, non-fiction was as inherently irrealistic as fiction. Weber, Literature of Facts. Novels and other works of fiction establish fictional worlds. What then is the difference? An answer to these worries sufficient for our purposes is simply that reality is reality and facts are facts, however they are to be understood, and that what is the case obviously does differ from what is not the case, even if the difference is somehow conventional, culturally specific, dependent on this or relative to that, or whatever. The insight that facts are not brute, if indeed they are not, is a far cry from collapsing the distinction. Many of the philosophers who have gone farthest in questioning the objectivity of the real world and arguing its dependence on us have made a point in retaining that notion and contrasting it to falsehood or unreality. Of course, we must distinguish falsehood and fiction from truth and fact, but we cannot, I am sure, do it on the ground that fiction is fabricated and fact found. Recognition of multiple alternative world versions, bit tokens, no policy of laissez-faire. Standards distinguishing right from wrong versions become, if anything, more rather than less important. Goodman, Ways of World Making. Kant did not doubt that we can be right or wrong about the objects of possible experience, conditioned though they are by our we don't know that. I'll just reread the quotation from Goodman. Of course, we must distinguish falsehood and fiction, but we cannot, I am sure, do it on the ground that fiction is fabricated and fact found. Recognition of multiple alternative word versions betokens no policy of laissez-faire. Standards distinguishing right from wrong versions become, if anything, more rather than less important. More rather than less important. Oh, that's interesting. Goodman. La distinction entre le vrai du faux ou le juste du non juste est plus importante dans la fiction que dans la réalité. Fish himself concurs, I am not claiming that there are no facts. I am merely raising a question as to their status in how to do things. So what's the fuss? Is it that although there are such things as truth and reality, they are not nearly as significant as we naively suppose? Some of Fish's remarks suggest as much, though Goodman just expressed dissent. Of the various stories we tell one another, Fish says the true ones are merely more popular, more prestigious than others. What counts as reality is given by the story or stories which happen to be standard. Non-standard ones are merely non-authorized. But truth and reality, whatever they are, obviously do matter. However unconcerned the ancients may have been about the truth value of the already story, they surely did care whether reports of an impending attack or the death of a leader were true or merely fictional. It is fictional in Doctor Strangelove that the world is destroyed by nuclear war. We fervently hope that this will not turn out to be true. The difference is enormous, and nothing could matter more. Are the notions of truth and reality important theoretically as well as in everyday life? Berkeley, Kant, and Goodman certainly thought so, and we must agree. They are so central to our thinking, indeed it is hard to imagine what it would be like to think without them, that they are surely inseparable from the subject matter of any investigation of human institutions. An investigator cannot dispense with the very thing he is investigating. The subject of this study is the institution of representation, and an integral part of it is the difference between truth and fictionality, the possibility of propositions being true but not fictional, or fictional but not true, or both, or neither, and the role of these combinations in our personal and social experience. One fundamental difference between the real world and fictional ones, if both are somehow man-made, lies in the manner in which we make them. A particular work of fiction, in its context, establishes its forms of intuition and categories of understanding. Berkeley, while contending that nothing has absolute existence, distinct from being perceived by God and exterior to all minds, was careful to preserve the ordinary distinction between real things and chimeras formed by the imagination or the visions of a dream through dialogues. Rorty argues for a pragmatic theory of truth as against correspondence theories, but allows that in one sense of world there is no argument about the point that it is the world that determines truth and calls this an uncontroversial triviality. World well lost. We need not ask for more. But fictional world then generates the fictional truths belonging to it. A particular biography or history does not itself establish the truth of what it says or produce the facts it is concerned with. What generates facts, if they are our own creations, is not individual pieces of writing, but something more like the whole body of a culture's discourse, or the language itself as opposed to what is said in the language, or the conceptual scheme embodied in neither of these. Every piece of discourse or thought which aspires to truth has a reality independent of itself to answer to, whatever role sentient beings might have in the construction of this reality. The fictional world corresponding to a given work of fiction is not thus independent of it. Fish himself ends up observing that in denying the absolute opposition between language that is true to some extra institutional reality and language that is not, he is not denying that a standard of truth exists, and that by invoking it, we can distinguish between different kinds of discourse. It is just that the standard is not brute, but institutional, not natural, but made. What is remarkable is how little this changes. It is unclear how this remark is to be reconciled with his claim that the distinction between serious and fictional discourse cannot be maintained. Indeed, nothing relevant to our conception of fiction seems to have changed. We do not have to solve all of reality's problems in order to treat our own. Two kinds of symbols. We have seen that fictionality has nothing essentially to do with what is or is not real or true or factual. That it is perfectly compatible with assertion and communication, including straightforward reporting of the most ordinary matters of fact, yet entirely independent of them. That it is not essentially the product of human action nor paradigmatically linguistic, and that fiction is not parasitic on serious discourse or non-fictional uses of symbols. These results, unexpected though some of them are, flowed easily from the simple intuition that to be fictional is, at bottom, to possess the function of serving as a prop in games of make-believe. The boundaries of the fictional have not become much more distinct than they were when we began, although they have been relocated somewhat. but it is hoped that asking whether a given work is fiction or non-fiction, as we now understand this question, will lead to a better appreciation of what it is and how it works and in what ways it is like and unlike various other things, even when no straightforward answer is forthcoming. Works of fiction are simply representations in the sense defined in Chapter 1, except that they are works, human artifacts, whereas representations need not be. The class of representations needed to be differentiated on one side from non-representational or non-objective works of art, as Rothko and Mondrian paintings and Bach inventions might seem to be, although I have suggested they are not, and from ordinary trees and chairs. On the other side, representations must be distinguished from works of non-fiction. Committee reports, economics textbooks, and so on. By construing works of fiction and other representations in terms of make believe, we draw both distinctions at once. Neither trees and chairs and whatever non objective works of art we might want to exclude, nor economics textbooks and committee reports, have the function of serving as props in games of make believe. This procedure is itself unorthodox. It is natural to think of the two distinctions as arising in sequence. First, one recognizes a large class of symbols or signs or symbol systems or symbolic behavior, what might be called representations in a sense broader than mine, excluding ordinary trees and chairs and any non-representational works of art, but including both fiction and non-fiction. After that, one turns to the task of separating the two species of this genus. This picture obscures the breadth of the gap between fiction and serious discourse or non-fictional uses of symbols, and it does not sufficiently discourage thinking of fiction as a deviation from serious discourse. The only genus big enough to hold both serious discourse and symbols used non-fictionally, as well as what I call representations, works of fiction, will, I fear, be too big to be illuminating. Shall we understand the genus to be the class of things that pick out or specify propositions? Perhaps its species can be distinguished by what is done with the propositions, whether they are asserted or questioned or made fictional, for instance. This makes the genus a semantic category and its division into species a matter of pragmatics. We should not assume that picking out propositions is always logically prior to using them for some purpose or other. Perhaps it is in the case of linguistic symbols. Perhaps a text in its context specifies propositions by virtue of the semantics of the language, independently of whether it asserts them or makes them fictional or what. Even this is doubtful. The propositions a novel makes fictional are often not those that its words, given the semantics of the language, express, and not those that would be asserted by someone who spoke or wrote those words assertively. One must know that it is a novel and that its job is to generate fictional truths, in order to decide what propositions it picks out and makes fictional. But often, I suspect, it is only by virtue of making a proposition fictional or by being used to assert it that something can be said to pick it out at all. To pick it out at all. It is only by virtue of making a proposition fictional or by being used to assert it that something can be said to pick it out at all. I suggest that it is by virtue of their role in make believe that pictures pick out the propositions they do. This does not invalidate the genus. The class of things that pick out propositions may constitute a recognizable kind even if the devices by which they do so are different in different cases. But the kind threatens to expand out of control. What about things that make propositions true? The act of throwing a ball through a hoop in the course of a basketball game picks out the proposition that a goal is scored. What it does with this proposition is to make it true. Perhaps it does the former by accomplishing the latter. The arrival of Amundsen at the South Pole, given the circumstances, made true the proposition that Scott came in second. A perfectly spherical stone makes it true that there is a perfectly spherical stone. Doesn't it then pick out this proposition? Will our Guinness have to include absolutely everything? It is not obvious that making a proposition fictional is any less like making it true than like, for instance, serving as a vehicle for asserting it. Some uses consist of it being employed by a person for some purpose and others do not. The assertive use of a textbook consists in someone's using it to assert. Making it true that there is a spherical stone is something the spherical stone itself does. But in this respect, fiction belongs with the stone rather than the textbook. Some may look for relief to the idea that conventional means of specifying propositions are to be distinguished from natural ones. Shall we count pictures and texts, whether fiction or non-fiction, and also presumably the throwing of a basketball through a hoop symbols on the ground that it is by virtue of conventions that they pick out propositions, and justify excluding the round stone because it is not? Possibly. But after reading Quine and Wittgenstein, we should be less than sanguine about the prospects of making this distinction stick. It is only within a cultural context that a picture or a story or a textbook picks out the propositions it makes fictional or serves to assert. Is it? No doubt. But the operation of the round stone in picking out and making true the proposition that there is a round stone may also be culturally relative. Perhaps the cultural context comes in differently, but this will have to be shown. Chiseling out a usefully limited natural kind comprising both fictional and non-fictional symbols is a formidable task at best. I do not know whether it is possible, but we can take the category of representations, of works and non-works of fiction, understood as things with the function of serving as props in games of make-believe, and run with it. Sorry. Objects of representation. What objects are? Sorry. War and Peace is a novel about Napoleon. A Tale of Two Cities is about London, Paris, and the French Revolution. Cézanne's Montagne Sainte-Victoire is a picture of Mount Sainte-Victoire. Let us say that Napoleon is an object of War and Peace, that London, Paris, and the French Revolution are among the objects of A Tale of Two Cities, and that La Montagne Sainte-Victoire has as its most prominent object Mount Sainte-Victoire. A thing is an object of a given representation if there are propositions about it which the representation makes fictional. We have seen that many of our imaginings are about actual things. Such imaginings are sometimes prescribed by props. When it is the function of a work to prescribe imaginings about a thing, the work generates fictional truths about it. It is an object of the representation. Paris is an object of A Tale of Two Cities because A Tale of Two Cities makes it fictional of Paris that it exists, that it was the site of meetings by a certain Madame Defarge, and so on. To say what a work is of or about, or what it represents, or portrays, or depicts, is often to specify its objects. But these expressions have other jobs also. They are too promiscuous to provide a reliable guide to the objects of representation. I will usually limit them to this role, however, unless it is clear to the contrary. When I say that a work is of or about a given thing, or represents or portrays or depicts it, I will mean that the thing is an object of the work in the sense indicated, that the work generates fictional truths about it. Representation as is a matter of which propositions about its subjects a work makes fictional. To represent a person as being tall or clever is to make it fictional of him that he is tall or clever. Ordinarily, works represent their objects as existing, but not always. One could write a story in which someone wakes up one morning to discover that George Bush's election to the presidency in 1988 was only a dream, and in which Mao Zedong was a myth perpetrated by publicity agents working for an anonymous Chinese bureaucracy. George Louis Borges has not, to my knowledge, written a story of this kind. The story makes it fictional of Bush's election that it did not occur, and of Mao Zedong that he did not exist. Nevertheless, it is Bush's actual election and the real Mao Zedong which fictionally have no existence. The real Mao is an object of the story, even though in the story he is not real. He is represented, misrepresented, as being non-existent. So objects of representations are not to be thought of simply as things that reside in their fictional worlds. Many have remarked that all representation is representation as. This follows easily from my definitions. To represent a thing is not just to pick it out somehow, but to make some proposition about it fictional, and to do that is to represent it as something, as being such that that proposition is true. It is by representing its object as such and such that a work represents the object at all. It is not clear that all representations have objects, even though all can appropriately be described as being of or about something, or as representing something. Such is the promiscuity of, about, and represent. In any case, not all representations have actual things as objects. Unless we wish to say, rather vacuously, that the world or the universe is an object of every representation, that every representation makes it fictional of the universe that it contains unicorns. Yes. Or a man and a murder or whatever. Yes, why not? The unicorn tapestries are pictures of unicorns, but there are no actual unicorns that they picture. Yes, because it doesn't exist in real life. Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Telltale Heart, is about a man who commits murder, but no real-world man or murder is among its objects. We can say that the unicorn tapestries are unicorn representations, specifically unicorn pictures, and that the Telltale Heart is a man representation and a murder representation, a man story and a murder story, following Goodman, Languages of Art. But we are not yet in a position to explain what this means. These works generate at least de dicto fictional truths, ones not about any particular things. It is unicorn tapestries fictional that there are unicorns, and it is the Telltale Heart fictional that there is a man, at least one, who commits a murder. It is tempting to think that these representations also generate direct fictional truths about certain non-actual unicorns and about a certain non-actual man and a non-actual murder, ones to be found not in the real world, but in the pictures and in the story. We shall confront this temptation shortly, but until then we will be concerned only with objects of representation that are actual. Representation and matching. It is of the utmost importance that we distinguish representing from another relation that may obtain between representations and things in the world, one I will call matching. So representing and matching. A fat man representation can be said to correspond in one respect to all fat men. Informally, the man in the picture and any given fat man are alike in that both are fat. A fat man representing picture that is a portrait of a man who actually is fat. One representing a fat man as being fat corresponds thus to its objects. The picture and its objects may of course fail to correspond in other ways. The man may be short or poor, and the picture a tall man representation or a rich man representation. What I call matching is complete correspondence between a representation and something in the world. Informally again, a man picture matches a man if the man is in every detail exactly like the man in the picture. A story matches a person if that person is and does everything that a character in the story is and does. The character need not possess all the properties that the person does for the story to match him, although the reverse must be true. The person may have blonde hair, for instance, while the story is indeterminate with respect to the color of the character's hair. This explanation of matching assumes that there are such things as purely fictional people in pictures and characters in stories. There are no such things, I believe, but we do not now have the resources to define matching without making this assumption. One way to define it would be to say what I just did, taking this not literally but in the primary way statements appearing to make reference to fictitious entities and which involve unofficial games of make-believe are to be taken. A work may represent something it does not match, or match something it does not represent. Representing without matching is simply misrepresentation. Longfellow's ballad The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere portrays Paul Revere as riding to Concord on April 18, 1775, to warn the Americans of the approaching British army. Revere didn't actually do this. He was captured by the British before he got to Concord. The ballad misrepresents him, fails to match him. The Paul Revere in the poem made it to Concord, whereas the real one did not, but misrepresenting is representing nonetheless. The poem does represent Revere. Some of the propositions it makes fictional are about him, even if they are false. What about matching without representing? If a portrait of John is perfectly accurate, if it matches him, it just might match his identical twin brother as well. Or it might happen to match the brother even if it does not quite match John. Neither circumstance makes it a picture of the brother. The fictional truths it generates are about John, not about his twin. Suppose that Tom Sawyer, the character in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, has a double in the real world. There happens actually to have been a boy of that name who was and did everything Mark Twain's novel has the fictional Tom Sawyer being and doing, a boy, in other words, whom the novel matches. Mark Twain knew nothing of the real Tom Sawyer. The correspondence between him and the character is purely coincidental. Let's assume also that the boy lived out his life in obscurity and that few, if any, readers of the novel noticed the correspondence or could be expected to. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer is not about this actual boy. He is not one of its subjects. Must we say this? Could we regard Twain as having accidentally written a novel about a real person? We must resist the inclination to think that the issue here is a merely verbal one. Mark Twain's novel does not prescribe any imaginings about the real world counterpart of his character. Readers are in no way obliged, or expected to imagine of the actual Tom Sawyer that he got his friends to whitewash a fence, that he attended his own funeral, and so on. The fact that he happens actually to have done all those things has no bearing on what the novel asks us to imagine. This, at bottom, is why the real boy is not an object of the novel. To have something for an object is to generate fictional truths about it, to prescribe imaginings about it. Objects thus have a special role in the games of make-believe that are to be played with representations. What a representation matches has no such role, unless it happens to be an object also. To call both of them objects of representation would be to run roughshod over this important difference. We will shortly come to appreciate the distinction more fully, but if there is any lingering doubt that it is an intuitively natural one, consider the possibility of the fictional Tom Sawyer having more than one counterpart in the real world. Unless we are willing to say that The Adventures of Tom Sawyer is a novel about all of them, we will have to agree that matching does not suffice for representing. Determinants. What determines what a work represents? Sorry? Sorry. What determines what a work represents or whether it represents anything? This is a matter of what principles of generation are in effect. The principles in question, those whereby certain works prescribe imaginings about certain actual things, are loose, variable, and complex. I will undertake a more general examination of and other principles in Chapter 4, but it will be useful to keep in mind several circumstances which, in some traditions and for some genres with which we are familiar, appear have a part in determining the objects of representations. Readers acquainted with recent philosophical discussions of reference will find most of the suggestions that follow familiar. I regard representing in our sense, along with the relation between names and what they name, for example, as a species of reference. Some representations utilize ordinary linguistic reference to effect contact with their objects. Using the name of a well-known personage, Napoleon, Julius Caesar, for a character in a literary work commonly serves to establish the identity of the character with that person, to render the work a novel or play or poem about him. It is arguable that the person must be reasonably well known to the intended audience, that an author's using the name of an utterly obscure acquaintance does not suffice to make the acquaintance an object of his work. A work does not prescribe imaginings about someone, perhaps, unless it is reasonable to expect the audience to recognize that it does. It is arguable also that an accidental use of even a well-known name does not do the trick, that the author must have knowingly and deliberately used the name of the person in question. Otherwise, we have mere homonymy. The work does not represent him. Pictures often pick out their objects by means of titles. John Sloan's Maxorley's Bar is, by virtue mainly of its title, a painting of Maxorley's Bar in New York. Again, the mere fortuitous coincidence of a painting's title with the name of a real thing is probably insufficient. But it is my impression that the familiarity of the object to appreciators is usually understood to be less important in the case of painting than in that of literature. It may not matter if no one has heard of Maxorley's Bar. Sometimes nonverbal signs play a role. Halos help to specify objects of Renaissance paintings by limiting the possibilities to saints. Some may contend that only the intentions of the artist are operative, that works represent whatever their makers mean them to represent, and that names, titles, and nonverbal clues serve merely to indicate artists' intentions. No doubt there could be principles of generation to this effect. It could be understood that appreciators are to engage in imaginings about whatever artists intend them to engage in imaginings about. But I find it more reasonable to regard the artist's intention, in most cases, as but one of a loose collection of circumstances bearing on determination of what a work represents. When an artist paints from life, the slice of life from which he paints, the mountain or city or person he scrutinizes over his easel his easel is probably what his painting is a painting of. Intentions are involved, but not just the intention that a particular scene or thing be the object of the painting. The object guides the artist's hand as he paints, and he intends it to do so. The object of a photograph may sometimes be understood to be whatever reflected light into the lens of the camera and onto the film, thus producing the image, regardless of the photographer's intentions. My examples so far suggest that for something to be an object of representation, it must have a causal role in the production of the work. It must, in one way or another, figure in the process whereby the representation came about, either by entering into the intentions with which the work was produced or in some more mechanical manner. This seems to me to be right, and it separates representing sharply from matching, since no such causal link is required for matching. But even if representations must in fact be causally related to their objects, it is only a contingent fact that there is such a requirement. There could be a convention to the effect that works represent whatever they bear a high degree of correspondence to, or even one to the effect that they represent only what they match. The latter convention would be impractical, since matching is so difficult both to achieve and to ascertain. Even in actual cases, we probably want to allow that how close a representation comes to matching something. Wait. Even in actual cases, we probably want to allow that how close a representation comes to matching something has some bearing on whether it represents it. René Magritte's painting L'Annonciation portrays a weightlifter holding a bone in one hand and a bubble in the other, one of whose weights is his head. It hardly depicts the Annunciation, despite the title, even if Margaret intended it to, which is unlikely. It may be in some way symbolic of that event, but is not a picture of it. This suggests that there must be some correspondence between representations and their objects. Perhaps to represent the Annunciation, something must be at least an announcing representation. If so, having an appropriate causal relation to a representation is not sufficient for being its object, even if it is necessary. We must not overemphasize the causal relation that obtains between paintings and photographs done from life and the life they are done from. Fra Filippo Lippi used a local nun, Lucrezia Butti, as a model for his Madonna della Quintola. She posed for the picture just as many a nobleman has posed for his portrait. Yet Madonna della Quintola is not in the same sense a portrait of Lucrezia. Monroe Botsley's distinction between nominal and physical portrayal. Cf. She is not its subject, rather the biblical Mary is. The imaginings prescribed are about Mary, not about Lucretia. Authors sometimes model characters on people with whom they are familiar, or fictional events on actual ones, but this does not make the models objects of the author's works. No fictional truths about them need be generated. They simply assist the author in deciding what sorts of characters and fictional events to include in his work, what fictional truths to have it generate, however invaluable this assistance may be. David Copperfield is in one sense autobiographical, but it need not be regarded as generating fictional truths about Charles Dickens. I I have attempted only the roughest of sketches of what considerations bear on the determination of representation as objects. It will suffice for now to note that, typically, some combination of titles and like signs, artists' intentions, and other causal relations, together perhaps with a certain degree of correspondence, serves to establish the relation of representing. Part of the purpose of this observation is to clarify further the distinction between representing and matching. It also helps us to see how representing is related to representing and referring. We'll see that in 20 minutes.